Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we are talking about Nintendo Switch 2 in 2026. Now all of a sudden, the lineup is looking even better for next year. The games we're getting next year are looking to be pretty impressive. The Game Awards just happened a couple days ago, and there was actually a surprising amount of announcements for Nintendo Switch 2. So we're going to be talking about those announcements. We're also going to be talking about games we already know about officially coming for Nintendo Switch 2 in 2026 in conjunction with these latest things, and then also considering some other things that may be happening as well based off just what makes sense and some rumors that seem to have some serious weight. So when you think about it all, 2026 is starting to look pretty darn impressive for the second year of Nintendo Switch 2, which is very exciting. So that's what we're getting into today. Now before going forward, let me point out that I do have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, so if you find yourself enjoying my videos, I would very much appreciate your support. Subscribing if you haven't done so already, liking, commenting, it all makes a big difference. But I thank you for at least coming by to watch today's video. So let's first talk about some of the significant announcements for Nintendo Switch 2 that happened at the Game Awards. So one surprising announcement. South of Midnight. It's a game that came out this year, an Xbox Studios game, an actual Xbox published title, is now coming to Nintendo Switch 2. Another one is on the way. We already know about some Xbox games coming to Nintendo Switch 2, like Indiana Jones, and we are expecting more. There are rumors for games like, for example, Sea of Thieves to be coming to the console as well. And it definitely has me thinking that this is only going to continue to happen. Microsoft is basically going third party in a very big way, in the sense that a lot of their games, while they'll still be supporting their own Xboxes, they're also going to be putting their games on other platforms, which basically means PlayStation and Nintendo, and we're seeing more and more quality support. Moving past that, there were also some announcements for some cooperative games coming to Nintendo Switch 2, one of them being Out of Words, which looks interesting, but then there's also an exclusive coming to Nintendo Switch 2 that's a cooperative adventure game, and that's Orbitals. I actually like the art style for this one and the setting, so I'm going to be keeping my eyes peeled on this one. But let's start talking about some of the big announcements at the Game Awards. So we got confirmation that Leon S. Kennedy is going to be a significant character, basically the second protagonist to Resident Evil Requiem, Resident Evil 9. And this is a big deal, not just because Leon is awesome, but also because Resident Evil 9 is coming out at the same time on Nintendo Switch 2 as the other platforms, February 27th. And this is very interesting because the last time a mainline numbered Resident Evil game was available on a Nintendo platform its first day on the market was back for Nintendo GameCube when Resident Evil 4 came out as a timed exclusive, and the main character of that game was Leon S. Kennedy. So it's a very interesting full circle moment here, where Leon is back, Resident Evil is back, day and date on a Nintendo platform, and by the way, a lot of people have noticed that Resident Evil 9 seems pretty impressive on the Nintendo Switch 2. It's a fairly ambitious third-party game that's running at a surprising 60 frames per second on Switch 2. And from what we've been able to tell so far, it's been a pretty solid 60 FPS too. So this is extremely interesting. I am a longtime Resident Evil fan, in large part because of that Resident Evil presence back on Nintendo GameCube. So seeing it come back to Nintendo in such a strong way, very exciting stuff. And yet, that's not all Capcom has to offer early on next year for Nintendo Switch 2. On April 24th, Pragmata is also on its way to the console. They announced that it's also coming to Nintendo Switch 2, day and date, April 24th next year, and by the way, there's going to be an amiibo for Diana. This is an impressive looking game. I think it has a unique gameplay hook, so this is another one I'm keeping my eyes peeled on, and you know, I kind of am just loving the Capcom support. Outside of Nintendo, I think Capcom might be my favorite games publisher, and they're starting to show out here on Nintendo Switch 2, so I'm very much impressed with what we've seen so far. Their games are looking and running well, they're putting out the impressive ones at the same time as other platforms, so yeah, this is some very, very strong support from Capcom here. And so when you consider these announcements alongside what we already know about that at least the beginning of 2026 is looking to be pretty interesting. So reminder, Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade is coming to Nintendo Switch 2 on January 22nd. But we're also getting Animal Crossing New Horizons Nintendo Switch 2 edition on January 15th, and there is also going to be the free big 3.0 update. So there's going to be a substantial Animal Crossing update and this impressive version of Final Fantasy on Switch 2 in January. And then in February, yeah, we're getting Resident Evil, but Nintendo's also putting out Mario Tennis Fever. And then beyond that, we also know about Pokemon Pokopia, which is coming out in March, and then for Nintendo's spring schedule, we know about Yoshi and the Mysterious Book. There's also the Super Mario Bros. Wonder Switch 2 edition that's on the way. And then beyond that, we don't know when in 2026, but we have Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, and one would assume, even though it hasn't been confirmed yet, that Splatoon Raiders will be coming out sometime in the year of 2026. So this is the lineup we know about so far, and we've yet to get the early year Nintendo Direct, and I actually think this is a pretty big deal, because throughout most of the Switch era, we'd be going into the next years without really knowing much of what's to come in that next year until that early year Nintendo Direct, and yet here we are, and we know about so many things already. Like, think about this, when we came into the year of 2025, what did we know about? We knew about Xenoblade Chronicles X and Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. That was it. So by comparison, we know so much more about Nintendo's lineup for 2026 than we did for 2025 going into the new year. And yet, I don't really think we know that much about the lineup. Now, we do by comparison, but what I mean is, there are still some big surprises left to be revealed. We already know with some pretty strong confidence here that there's going to be a new mainline Pokemon game coming out next year. That's fairly predictable. Generation 10 will be coming out next year. According to the Terra leaks, which are legitimate leaks, we've seen actual leaked internal documentation for the next generation of Pokemon. Their target date is next year. It does make sense. It matches up with everything we're seeing, so that really shouldn't come as any surprise. But we've also heard that this game is going to be using a new engine, and they're trying out some fairly ambitious things, at least compared to their prior Pokemon projects. So this might be a significant leap for the Pokemon series, more so than some recent entries. And given that they have now extended things to a 4-year gap between generations as opposed to 3, there is reason for optimism here that things could be improving, especially because we are also hearing, now of course keep in mind these are from internal documents from a couple years ago, so plans can change, but it's supposedly going to be a Switch 2 exclusive, and with what we're hearing with how strongly Switch 2 is selling, they might be comfortable with actually putting out a mainline Pokemon game basically 11 months from now as an exclusive because of just how well Switch 2 is selling. And so that's going to be a big deal, but I know a lot of you watching may not be the biggest Pokemon fans. Even though Pokemon's a huge series, in terms of my audience, I definitely understand that not everyone that watches my channel is the hugest Pokemon fan. So if there's anything else that's going to appeal to the core Nintendo fan that's coming out in 2026, and there are some significant possibilities. There are rumors coming from a few different places that we may be seeing Monolith Soft's next project announced in an early year Nintendo Direct. One of the sources for this Monolith Soft rumor is Nash Weedle, who has gotten a lot of things right throughout this past year for Switch 2. If you take a look at it, it's really a ridiculous amount. He actually put out his own video addressing some claims that he's not reliable, and so I think if you take a look at that, you'll see just how reliable he is, as opposed to just going back and talking about everything he's gotten right and things he's gotten wrong. I'll just point people towards that video because that's a lot easier. It will be linked in the description below. Point is, considering the amount of leaks he's put out there, well, a lot of them have come to fruition with shocking consistency in my opinion, so I am inclined to believe that this rumor is true. But let's forget the rumors. It just makes sense to think that Monolith Soft should be close to giving us some kind of announcement. Why? Because they're actually pretty consistent with putting out content, and they only put out Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition early this year. I'm not saying they didn't have any work put into it, but it was not nearly as ambitious a project as the first Definitive Edition, and even then, it's just not a new game. So when you keep that in mind, along with their consistency, and also that they were working on a project throughout the entire Switch era that they are no longer hiring for, which seems to match up with what we've heard of this codename leak for Project Legacy, we might be seeing Legacy come out next year, this new IP. What's it going to be? Well, hopefully the rumors are true and we see it announced in the next Nintendo Direct. It could be a very big deal. I would love to see what Monolith Soft could pull off with a Switch 2 exclusive. A console that, at least according to Nvidia, is about 10 times more powerful than the Switch 1. So if Monolith Soft was able to put together all these masterpieces on Switch 1, what are they going to be able to do with Switch 2? I'm very excited to see what that's going to be. Now, another game that is rumored is a Zelda remake. We recently saw Nintendo just kind of put out their Zelda remake. Didn't say it would be for the Game Awards. We did talk about this a few days ago, and we talked about and said repeatedly and stressed, odds are not going to be at the Game Awards, because you just look at Nintendo's recent history. They haven't been announcing that many things themselves at the Game Awards, and even though there is a history of them putting announcements at the Game Awards in prior years, it's never an announcement for a brand new title. It's actually usually just an update on a title that's already been announced. So announcing a new project at the Game Awards always seemed very unlikely. That didn't happen. That doesn't change the fact that there are rumors from several places that a Zelda remake is in the works, which I think makes sense because Nintendo probably wants to put out something substantial Zelda early on for a Switch 2 era to bring in that Zelda fan base. And no, I don't think it's going to be a 2D remake. We just got Echoes of Wisdom in 2024. I think we're talking about something more substantial like a 3D Zelda offering, and it's also Zelda's 40th anniversary. So I definitely think there's some kind of Zelda goodness coming out next year, even if it's not an ambitious, epic 3D Zelda remake. I definitely think something is coming, but we've already talked about ad nauseum why I think a 3D Zelda remake is coming fairly soon, if not next year, fairly soon. So definitely a lot of Zelda stuff has a strong possibility of showing up next year, given that it's the anniversary. We're seeing Nintendo building up to the live-action movie. They've announced the Ocarina of Time Lego set coming out. But yes, a lot of Zelda goodness is also seemingly likely to fill up 2026. And then another strong consideration to put out there is 3D Mario. We usually get 3D Mario pretty early on into every generation. If there is not a 3D Mario announced for 2026, this would be unprecedented. Now, a lot of people are going to point to the fact that Donkey Kong Bonanza is also made by the Mario Odyssey team that just came out, and so that would lead people to believe that, well, that team was working on Donkey Kong Bonanza, therefore there is no 3D Mario coming out anytime soon. However, let's also keep in mind that the Odyssey team did not come out with anything else throughout the entire Switch era, outside of Mario Odyssey in its launch year. I have a hard time believing that Donkey Kong Bonanza is the only project this team was working on the entire time, not to mention that we've already seen that some key members that work for the Mario Odyssey team did not work on Donkey Kong Bonanza, suggesting that this team maybe broke up into multiple parts, multiple members, other people came in, and there's something else they have been working on, which I think is fair to say probably 3D Mario. Now, how far into development is it? That's where there's room for debate here. Maybe we are going to have to wait a little bit longer, but I think it's something worth considering, and it could possibly be one of Nintendo's big releases for the end of the year. Now, I do think we should look at what we already have for next year. We have Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, we have Splatoon Raiders, there's going to be a new generation of Pokemon. I haven't even mentioned this yet, but we are also getting the Dustbloods, a Switch 2 exclusive From Software title. That's going to be an enormous release for Switch 2. And so if we're also getting the next Monolith Soft title next year, Nintendo does have some pretty significant releases to come out throughout the year. And then if they also have Zelda stuff, whatever that is for the 40th anniversary, that would be some pretty significant content right there. If you throw in also a 3D Mario, maybe that's a little bit too much and they should spread things out a little bit. So basically, my perspective is, and I hope I'm wrong and we just get everything, but I'm not sure we get a new 3D Mario and a big Zelda remake in the same year. If it's a smaller scale remake, then maybe 3D Mario makes more sense to fit in there, but Nintendo may not want to put out both in the same year. I could also see a scenario where Nintendo does some smaller things for Zelda's 40th anniversary. We get the big new 3D Mario to follow up the release of the Mario Galaxy movie, and then in 2027, after the live-action Zelda movie comes out, that's when they're ready to put out a more ambitious Zelda project. Not the next totally brand new Zelda, but a remake as something to tide us over, get fans invested early on, and take advantage of all that Zelda excitement from the movie. And even with all of that said, there's still another project we are expecting an announcement on fairly soon, and that is the next project from Next Level Games. Yes, they offered some help for Metroid Prime 4, but they didn't develop Metroid Prime 4. We're not talking about a significant effort here that would take away from their own project by any significant margin. I mean, if we were actually following the Next Level Games pattern of release, they should have come out with a game this year. They haven't. So they're overdue. This is a pattern they've maintained consistently for quite some time, since the 3DS era, so I do think something is probably pretty close to completion that's been made by them, and there's a strong chance it's announced next year, and that could be Luigi's Mansion 4. They had such strong success with Luigi's Mansion 3, it makes total sense to me that they would want to follow that up early on into the Switch 2 generation, and I could even see a scenario where maybe they are going to hold back on 3D Mario a little bit. They put out Luigi's Mansion 4 this year, even though it's not the same kind of gameplay, given that it's still a big Mario kind of thing. If you also have like a big 3D Zelda remake, and then also Gen 10 Pokemon, and then Dustbloods, and Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, and Splatoon Raiders, and maybe even a Monolith Soft title, you can definitely hold back on something. So main point is, we have some strong third-party support, we have plenty of reason to think that some other big games could be announced next year, and there's already some decent stuff that's already confirmed for next year that normally we wouldn't know about going into the new year, but this time we do. Probably because this is the beginning of a new generation. And so the second year of Switch 2, which would also be the first full year of Switch 2, is set up to be pretty legendary. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.